Okay. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead. I'll start give a quick introduction on who I am, and then I'll start with our presentation. So as Paul said, my name is Nicole Dorn. I'm chair of Yes for Belmont. I've been a Belmont resident since 2013. Originally, I'm from Newton, Massachusetts. I have 2 kids in the Belmont Public Schools, a 2nd grader, who some of you just met, who's at the Wellington, and then a 5th grader at Chenery Middle School, and was involved previously in the 2015 and 20 override campaign, the 2018 debt exclusion campaign. But this is my sort of first time as chair. I'm going to spend a few minutes, Paul and I are going to spend a few minutes kind of walking through our presentation, but we really do want to leave a lot of time for discussion and for questions. And so we'll go over a few slides and then open it up for questions. So first, just want to sort of highlight, what we're talking about here in terms of the override. So there is an election on the ballot, or a question on the ballot on April 6th about whether or not we're going to pass a $6.4 million override. In our minds, this passing the override provides Belmont with the funding it needs to preserve our town services that all of us depend on and support our students and seniors who need our support now more than ever. And that really the challenge is that a no vote would push Belmont towards a fiscal cliff with fewer staff to support our students, cuts to athletics, theater and music programs, and significant delays in town services that would reduce the overall quality of life in Belmont. So that's what we're talking about here today. I'm just going to check that no one's in the waiting room. Okay. And so really first just want to go over like why yes. And so, a key thing to keep in mind is while, in my mind, there's not a ton of like bells and whistles that we're adding here. There is, the issue really is twofold. So one is we need to, we've had over 900 students that have enrolled in Belmont Public Schools in the last 13 years. So we need to add teachers in order to address that enrollment growth and make sure we can make progress in reducing class sizes. We have over 100 classes at the high school that are above what the standard should be. We have classes with 35 kids in them at the high school, and large class sizes still at the middle school and some elementary classrooms as well. And it also would allow us to better support our students. We would, with this override, we could hire a social worker at the high school. As someone who works in education, honestly, I was quite shocked to hear that we didn't have a social worker at the high school, hire math coaches at the elementary school. But this is also just not about the schools, it's also about the whole town. The school budget, 60% of the whole town's budget goes to the schools, but that means 40% is going to the entire town. And so the override would also help make sure that we can provide a social worker to seniors. That's something that the Council of Aging has been asking for since 2012, I believe. But it also allows us to maintain the programs that we have. The library, the rec department is close to being able to, their programs are pretty affordable now. And then last but not least, we have a lot of plans to optimize energy and efficiency at the new 7 through 12 school and other buildings, and passing the override would allow us to hire a systems manager that would ensure we can really get the benefits out of those buildings in terms of energy efficiency and savings, which is estimated to be about $200,000 per year. I think the biggest thing to keep in mind from our perspective, though, is that there really is just the cost of not doing anything right now. So we'd have to reduce the number of teacher and staff positions next year at the schools by 21 fewer teacher and staff positions. That would include 10 or 11 existing positions and 7 existing teachers. So that would result in increased class sizes. We have, since 2015, we've cut the number of overcrowded classrooms at the elementary school from 42% to 10%. All that progress would be lost if the override was to fail. We also estimate that we'd have to cut 40% of the budget for athletics, music, theater programs, the arts. And there's a real trickle down effect to this, so that, when those cuts happen, like things like AP art and other courses, those could be impacted, because it's really a matter of like just limited resources to provide those kind of programs to students. We also right now, we are we would not be able to fill an open police officer position, an open firefighter position. We are already under capacity as a town to where the recommended levels are for staffing some of these departments. We only have one building inspector right now. So if the override were to fail, we would keep that at one inspector, and that means that all kind of town-wide ordinances couldn't be enforced. So we couldn't really have the capacity to enforce things like the snow shoveling ordinance. And then last but not least, at our Parks Department, I mean, they will continue to provide services. They will continue to pick up trash and fill potholes and plow streets, but there will just be significant delays because they'll be working with fewer people. And then at the library, they would have to cut hours and programs. And then last but not least, there's just a big backlog of deferred maintenance and repairs across our town. And so we would continue to have to defer a lot of that should the override fail. So why did we get there? I'm going to turn this over to Paul now, who's going to talk about like, how did we get here and why do we need the override now?
Thanks, Nicole. So, I think most of you who are on the line are not newbies to town politics or.
Oh, yes, but I've got the Zoom on. I got the Zoom on, but.
Hey, Chris.
My picture. I got the Zoom on.
Hey, just mute Chris. So no, most of you are new to Belmont town politics or even to the budget. I think what it's important to understand about our town budget, like many town budgets, is that, it is constrained. It's constrained by Proposition 2.5 that limits how much the property tax levy, in other words, the gross amount that we raise from residential property taxes can go up in a year to 2.5%. And that is about more than 80% of our revenue as an operating organization, as a $140 million, $130 million a year nonprofit called Belmont. Most of that revenue, the vast majority, comes from property taxes, and those are capped at 2.5% per year. That's okay, as with any family or organization, as long as your costs don't go up. And our costs have gone up by and large as a result of things that we as a town cannot control, like adding more than 900 students in 13 years. Those are students that we are legally mandated to educate. We're legally mandated to provide special education service, English language service, transportation, teachers, classrooms, supplies, materials, the whole gambit of things that are needed to educate a child. But Proposition 2.5 is silent on that. The mechanism for dealing with those types of unforeseen externalities are overrides, and that's why we're doing an override. We are required by law to fund the pension liabilities for our workers. I've heard people kind of complain about that, but you need to remember that if you're a pension employee for the town of Belmont, you do not collect Social Security. You do not pay into Social Security. Belmont is your Social Security. That pension is your security in old age. And so we obviously have to continue supporting that, both for our existing employees and people who have worked for us and retired. Healthcare costs as well for our current and former employees. And despite what Prop 2.5 says, those costs go up by well more than 5% a year. And have historically. Again, all things that Prop 2.5 is silent on. So that kind of creates, that puts us in a pincer, really, between between more or less flat revenue, capped by Prop 2.5, and rising expenses, and then things that are out of our control. Again, adding, 900 students in a little more than a decade. Next slide, Nicole. And so, the town has done many things over the last decade to try and limit the growth of its expenses and cut expenses where it can. In addition, we did pass the 2015 override 6 years ago that provided money to hire new teachers to address the overcrowding problem and the staffing problem in the school, to increase funding for roads and sidewalks, because our roads and sidewalks had really been let go, and we were able to accelerate investments in those. In addition, we've generated as a community or found new sources of revenue. We put parking meters back in town center and on parts of Trapello Road. That was something that I actually lobbied the Board of Selectmen for personally and passionately, that we were giving away parking, and parking is one of the few non-tax revenue sources that we have. So we have added, as you've seen, electronic parking meters back, which is great. We've done a lot more with facility rentals for our buildings. Obviously the trash overflow bags generate a certain amount of revenue. We're going to be having marijuana dispensaries, pot shops in town. It's going to be a party, and it's going to generate a good amount of, again, non-tax revenue, both in licensing fees for those as well as in sales taxes on the product. So, Belmont has been aggressive in looking for new sources of revenue. In addition, Patrice Garvin, our new town administrator, relatively new, has really increased the amount of grant money that has come into Belmont, something like $4 million in grants since the beginning of her tenure. That was money that previous town administrators had not been active or anxious to go after. It's obviously time consuming and takes a fair amount of coordination to do it, but Patrice has been adamant about doing that. And we have done a good job controlling the growth of our costs. Our healthcare costs went from 9% to 5%, whereas our pension payments, the growth in pension payments has declined from 6.8% annually to 4.5%. We've done restructuring of the rec department. I think the new assistant town administrator is doubling as the rec director, kind of consolidating positions. And of course, the new 7 through 12 school is going to have significant savings over the life of the building. It's a zero net energy building. I believe it's LEED certified, or it's going to be, and that is going to generate huge savings for the town. As a town meeting member, I can remember both the maintenance on the aging boilers and just the grim statistics you'd get about how inefficient it was to heat that building in the winter. And so that was just money flying out the windows, literally. That will not happen with the new building, which is great. So we run pretty lean as a community. But the reality is, again, we are a town of homes. We have a small commercial property base in this town. We always have. We have generally not been super hospitable to large scale commercial developments like office parks and the like, or hotels, or large restaurants or entertainment facilities like Cambridge has, let alone corporate headquarters, Google, IBM, et cetera. We are very reliant on homeowners and property tax revenue. We can do a little bit, we can do some to change the growth, the shape of that curve, but the fundamentals of Belmont's budget are kind of baked in. And that leaves us kind of where we are today. Nicole, I'll hand back to you.
Great. Thank you, Paul. And so, one of the things that you might have heard is that, well, Belmont is expected to receive $8.6 million in federal aid. Given that, why do we still need an override? And the fact of the matter is that, one thing to keep in mind is the override is a $6.4 million override, but that $6.4 million is what it increases our total tax levy for next year. And that then provides a larger base that the 2.5% increases are applied to. And that enables us to close our 3-year gap of $19.7 million. And so a lot of people, I think, get confused because they think, well, $8.6 million, in federal funding, $6.4 million override, isn't our problem solved? And the fact is that the $6.4 million override is the amount that we increase our tax levy next year to address this $20 million gap over 3 years. So we can't, even if we could use all of that funding for operating expenses, which we can't, it would not be enough to close this $20 million gap over the next 3 years. And the fact of the matter is that we're not going to be able to just take that money. It doesn't go right into our checking account, and we can't just draw down on it. A lot of it is restricted for things like water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure, or compensating essential workers, or COVID related expenses. And our structural deficit is not caused by COVID. It's not a COVID caused deficit. It is something, as Paul explained, that's tied to our historic surge in enrollment and rising healthcare costs that rise greater than the 2.5% that our revenue can increase. There is, the potential also and that some of it could be used for operating expenses. But our town and our schools, they knew they would have COVID expenses next year. So for example, if we need to provide a remote learning option for students in the fall, for any students that aren't vaccinated yet and don't feel safe going to school, that's on our town to cover the costs of. If we want to provide testing for students and for teachers in the fall, that's on our town to cover the costs of. We always intended to use federal funds to cover those expenses. So the town kind of assumed, that we would get federal funding, we'd get more COVID aid. So that money will go towards directly tying these expenses that we already know we are going to have. And then the last piece is the bucket, the restricted piece that really could be plugged into operating expenses is tied back to this question of, well, how much did your local receipts decline due to COVID? And Patrice has done the estimates, and that's only estimated to be about $700,000. So we might be able to use $700,000 of this money for our operating expenses. But as you can see here, that doesn't even come close to covering our $20 million gap. And it doesn't come close to meeting the $5.7 million gap we have in our budget for next year. So it is good for Belmont. I mean, I think I know a lot of the concerns of folks, rightfully so right now, is that it's a hard time for a lot of residents, families, and businesses are struggling. The good news is that both residents and businesses will get some relief with the COVID aid. But the other good news is that part of the restrictions of this money is that the town can use it to provide support to residents in paying like mortgage expenses and rental assistance, and can support small businesses. So in my mind, it's actually a win-win for Belmont, because it lets us, we pass the override on April 6th, we can address our structural deficit, and we can use the federal funds then to provide some relief to our residents and our small businesses. And the other thing just to keep in mind is that this problem only gets more expensive if we wait. And that is also true, even if we could use all of the federal funding next year to close our budget gap, which we can't, but even if we could, we still would need a bigger override next year. There is zero scenario where we don't need a more expensive override next year. So if you are concerned about increasing the burden on taxpayers, the only option is to pass the override now, or else we would need a more expensive next year that's just going to put more of a burden on taxpayers, or really have to make really painful cuts to the town, because that gap, as our expenses go up at this rate and our revenue goes at this rate, it just gets bigger and bigger. And then if we don't do this now, we're looking at a $5 to $8 million hole in our budget next year that after already having to make cuts this summer and reduce teachers and reduce services, really that would be, I think, truly devastating for the town. I mean, we're talking about, some of the options would be things like maybe we need to close the pool, maybe we need to eliminate all AP classes. I don't know. Again, this is not about this year. This is about if the override doesn't pass and next year we need a bigger override. And then if that didn't fail, really we're looking at like things that I think would ultimately change the quality of life in Belmont. So a lot of people I think are one of the things that's really resonated with me in talking to residents who are in favor of the override is that, look, this is no one wants to see their taxes increase. No, this is always a hard time to do this, but ultimately this is the most cost-effective way. This is actually the most fiscally responsible way to do it, because we sort of address the structural deficit in a way that limits the burden on taxpayers as much as we can, spends down our cash reserves in a responsible manner, and really doesn't put Belmont in this precarious financial position. So I'll stop there. We have some ways here that we can support our campaign if you're so moved to do so. But why don't I stop there and we can answer some questions.
If you have questions, you want to have people raise their hand or
sure. Yes.
I think either way, you can either use the chat channel, I'm looking at that, or you can raise your hand if you're a Zoom Jedi and know how to raise your hand.
Yes, feel free to put them in the chat. Feel free to raise your hand.
Let me just see here. There can't be no questions.
Well,
yeah, or just speak up. Hey, Roger.
Hi. Thanks for doing this. And, great job last night, Nicole. that I've heard from. One question I've heard from people is so this is a 3-year plan as it's laid out, and and maybe we'll get lucky like last time and be able to stretch it 1 or 2 years more. But some people are thinking, well, okay, I understand the current need. I understand maybe it needs to happen now and can't be put off till next year. But where are we? Where are we in 3 years or 4 years? Are we looking at another override then? And so partly, when does it end?
Yeah.
So it does. In other words, it's not. We talk about solving the structural deficit. It's not really solving structural deficit. It's addressing it for a given period of time, and then it's back, and then it's back. And I think sort of I detect some frustration. For any given override, you can wrap your head around it, but the prospect of just this endless, into the future string of overrides. So what's a good way to talk to people about that?
So first, I do think that this might be something people don't want to hear, but I do think that unless we as a country can pass things like universal basic health care or increase the amount of federal dollars that flow to local governments, it's going to be really hard for any municipality like Belmont, that is the town of homes and has limited commercial base, to get your year-over-year expenses down to 2.5%. But I don't know if without that happening, we could say we'll never need another override. But I do think it's very important to make those as far between as possible and as manageable for taxpayers as possible. And I do think it would be hard to come back to Belmont residents every 3 years for an override. That is not sustainable, I don't think, as a town. And so what I see as the path forward for Belmont is 2 things. One, our enrollment is expected to level off in 2024. And a large part of this is driven by just the surge in enrollment. That will level off. And that will relieve a lot of the pressure on our budget and make it so that we don't need to be coming back to taxpayers every few years. And I thought Roy Epstein made a really good case for this at the select board meeting when he voiced his support for the override, is that look, yes, we do need to do this now, but he kind of explained how he was confident that we can get to a point where we don't need to be coming back to residents every few years. And honestly, we haven't done that. I mean, the 2015 was last override. Before that, it was 2010. So it's not like we actually have come back with residents for overrides every few years. It really has been every 5 to 6 years. But really, even that might be too much. We might want to get to the point where it's every 8 years or so.
Yeah, I mean,
the other piece is just quickly one more thing is I do think this is a matter of an and, not an or, when you think about structural reform. I think the town has aggressively pursued structural reform, and that's what pushed the 2015 override from 3 years to 6. And we absolutely have to keep doing that. I mean, Elizabeth Dion, I found her argument really compelling in a Belmont News Now, where she was talking about some opportunities she saw for structural reform. And if you listen to the beginning of what she said, you might think, oh, she must be against the override. But she ended up by saying, no, we absolutely do need this override now, because we are at this point where if we don't pass it, the cuts to the town and the schools are just going to be too hard to bear. And we also need to aggressively pursue structural reform. And that's what's going to keep any overrides we do have manageable for taxpayers and as far between as we possibly can make them. I don't know, Paul, what you want to add?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, I think, when you think about Belmont, I mean, we are a community with more than 4,000 children that we have to educate. Educating kids is a resource and people intensive business. We have a substantial amount of capital infrastructure that, frankly, through much of the 80s and 90s, we ignored and did not do, regular maintenance on. And so there's a lot of deferred investment there. We have a police force and a fire department. And so, there's Belmont is always going to have, needs. I think when we talk about structural reform, what we're talking about is kind of bending that curve of expense growth and looking for opportunities around the margins to lower our overhead and maybe realize some new sources of revenue, whether that's facility rentals, whether it is, in the long term, outsourcing some town functions to third parties and realizing cost savings there and so on. But again, that's not going to flip the budget upside down and suddenly find us with tons of money sitting in our lap. It's going to change. It's going to slowly maybe curve the rate of growth. But again, short of massive new federal and state assistance and aid to local communities. And again, the example I'd like to use is, Belmont High, when we built it in the early 1970s, was an $8 million building with $4 million of it paid by the federal and state governments and $4 million paid by the town of Belmont. The 7 through 12 school, 50 years later, a $280 or $90 million building with, maybe 30, 25% of it paid by the state and the rest on our town. And the difference between those two structures says a lot about what has happened in the last 50 years and the burden on local communities like Belmont to basically take care of ourselves. And it sucks, but we need to take care of ourselves, and we need to take care of our kids, and we need to keep up the quality of life that makes this town what it is and makes it a desirable place to live. We've got a big federal aid package coming, and there's going to be money coming to towns like Belmont. That's great. Hopefully there's more down the road, and God willing, there will be. But absent that, I think Nicole's right. The fundamentals of how our budget works are not going to change. Moderna is probably not going to move their corporate headquarters to Belmont. There just isn't. We don't have that kind of space. So we are what we are.
Yeah. The other just thing to keep in mind is I think it also it does tie back a little bit to the schools in the sense of, there has been a lot of increase in compliance and mandated requirements on schools that do require staff.
Yes.
And are not funded. I mean, it's something I used to work in education, and it drives me nuts. It's something you could talk to Will Brownsberger about. The state just continuously passes regulation upon regulation on our schools that districts have to comply with, and they don't provide any funding for those. And it's really frustrating. I know, Scott Stratford, you had your hand up.
Oh, yeah. Am I muted? Where am I here?
Nope, we can hear you.
Oh, terrific, thanks. Well, so long ago, I'm not sure. Well, first of all, we have a selectman candidate listening in, and I'm considering strongly voting for him. My other option is blank. And I don't know, Mark, it's quite honestly, having you coming back on board is, I think, going to be very reassuring to a lot of people, because you did so much wonderful work with the first of the financial task forces, and then the second one that brought us to this point, and then of course there's this structural change thing happening. But I'm curious, as a former school committee member, like Paul, but I lasted a little longer, what kind of structural changes? I mean, the school budget, as you pointed out, is better than 3/5 of the town's operating budget, and it's going up as a percentage every year because the costs of drivers. What structural changes has the school department and school committee committed to help curb that, given that, as Paul has pointed out so many times, our cost per pupil, spending per pupil is lower than other places, and our enrollment keeps going up. What are the schools throwing into this pot to reassure voters that they're doing whatever they can to mitigate the cost drivers in the long run, the ones that Roger's raising, as well as the ones that are immediately before us for this override?
Mark, do you want to take a crack at that, or Paul, do you want to take a crack at that?
No, I'll take a crack. I mean,
So
thanks
was
for
it just the question was to Mark or to me and Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I'll comment. And first and foremost, I strongly support this override. I think everything Nicole said is right on point, and what Paul said as well. I think that just the structural deficit is simply this, that our expenses will continue to go up more than 2.5% to 3% every single year, which they have been. And the enrollment increases have exacerbated that, right? And so we do our level of services, mean we keep up the same level of services every year. So when you have increased enrollment, you don't add teachers or you don't add counselors, you're not providing level services. I think people miss that point. And we certainly haven't added many, individuals on the town side, and frankly, from an infrastructure perspective, we need to do a hell of a lot more. So we absolutely need these funds, but we also need to look at ways to institute structural reform, Paul, Scott, to your point, which is really hard to do. And it's not a quick fix thing either. It's really years in the making, and it's either intermunicipal agreements. I think regionalization, frankly, can't work, but we can attempt that. But I think the schools, and I've talked to John Phelan about this, and I've talked to Mike colleagues on the board, we just have to have the political will to commit to structural reform because it's not sustainable. We can't have, I think we absolutely need periodic overrides, right? So I, was the architect of the 2015 one. Thankfully that passed, partially involved here and the architect of this one. I'm hoping it passes. If it doesn't, we absolutely have to go out again next year because we're going to be in desperate straits. We can't look, as Paul said, to the state to bail us out. They just won't. We'd love to see them increase their Chapter 70 funding like they committed to several years ago. With our special ed expenses going up and English as, English language learners going up and all of the mandates that we are legally required to pay those services and morally as well. So we do need periodic overrides. I think, Scott, the school administration and perhaps the school committee, we need to refocus our efforts at, and we have the lab collaborative and things of that nature. So I think there's attempts there, but I think we need to a more effective job of structural reform. And as Paul, I like your term, Paul, bending the curve on expenditure growth, which will never fully bend because bottom line is everyone's expenses go up more than 2.5%, 3% every year. And that's the idea. I mean, Proposition 2.5 only meant one thing, that is it gave the voters an opportunity to say yes or no to tax increases, whereas before you could just increase it. And we're never going to bleed enough taxes out of our commercial base. It's only 4%. I think the mistake we made in 2015 is that we didn't plan for an override sooner than this year. We should have done that, frankly. I mean, stretching it was fine, but I don't think that's the way to do business. And I said this last night, people misunderstood me. I mean, I strongly support this override that, I think we need to plan for the future. Paul, you suggested this. We need to have a 5 to 10 year plan, which includes periodic infusion of revenues through tax overrides. And I feel bad for folks that are struggling in this community. I get it. I hear from a lot of people, but there's no other way out of this other than we have to decide as a community that we're going to do with less services or we're going to cut some services. And I mentioned that as well as a possibility, looking at performance management as an approach. So I know that's a long answer to your question, Scott, and it's great to, I haven't seen you quite a while at church and look forward to seeing you and in the future. But that's really the plan. That's what I'm committed to, is establishing a long-term plan that takes into consideration periodic overrides that are more affordable than perhaps 6.4, and also structural reform that bends the expense curve, and then lobbying our state legislatures to provide more state aid to Belmont. I mean, there's no other way out of it in my mind, unless we want to decide to cut services. And I don't know what we're going to cut, because right now, it's not like we're providing luxury services to everybody. I mean, I think folks on this line would agree that we do basic services, which we want to do. And beyond that, I'm not certain how much more we do beyond that. So sorry, it took more
That's okay.
time than needed to go.
Well, Paul, I'll just point out to Mark, and again, it's a little off message for you all, but we're in church every Sunday, Mark. So, anytime. Virtually. Now it's reassuring to see that you know how to use Zoom. I wasn't sure about that. I mean, there are a couple of factors I just want to mention. One is that, people have been walloped so hard with the increases this year in their property taxes and their assessments. I find there's a lot of general, absolute head scratching confusion as to both what's happened to valuations and the overall tax hit, because now phase 2 of the debt exclusion is coming in. So the timing for an override isn't terrific.
I mean, stinks, Paul, Scott. The pandemic, the tax increases from. Well, let's just state the reality of it. We still need it. The timing's not great. I mean, we have the increases from the debt exclusion, which we supported. We needed to support. The school was I went there. It was old when I went there. And so we needed to replace it because we needed more room, right? The timing is not great because of the pandemic, but we can't afford to wait. And I feel bad about that because I think there are some families in town, seniors and other families that are struggling financially. I hear that and I'm empathetic. It doesn't mean that we don't need it.
Yeah.
So, it's hard to, I think, Scott, it's hard to say, how do we address that? I think that for the seniors in town, we certainly need to do more as it relates to tax relief or other types of relief. Cambridge does a boatload of things. And I've talked to Bob Reardon about this. On the assessments, a lot of people are scratching their heads, in terms of how different parts of town have increases more than other parts. Now, we can only raise taxes up to the levy limit. So at the end of the day, you know, we're not taxing people. We're not increasing taxes on everyone. We're just sort of leveling it out, if you will. I think we need to look at that. Even though the assessments happen the first of every year based on last year's value, we really need to look at, you know, or at least communicate more effectively and more transparently how we do assessments, because people just don't understand that. I mean, I think transparency came up several times last night. And I think that's a message to me as I enter, you know, another term here on the board, and my colleagues on the board and the school committee and the school administration, town administration, that I don't think they were intentionally not being transparent. I just think we need to do a better job of it. And so I'm committed to that, because I think we need to inform our residents about the need more than we have.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the different departments and what are really the needs, line by line if we have to. And I know that that's mind numbing for some, right? But at least, Paul, it's out there. Don't you agree? The more information, the better. If people want to access it, they can.
And on the assessments, I mean, I think one thing that we all are kind of aware of, and I know just because working on the campaign, we've been looking at a lot of this data, like, you know, the sales prices in our community have absolutely gone through the stratosphere in the last 4 years, 5 years, even, and before that, the growth was considerable. And, you know, assessments by the town obviously are impacted substantially by, you know, arm's length transactions of similar properties in similar neighborhoods. And so if, you know, if your neighbor's house just went up by 30% in the last 3 years, you're going to see that in your assessment. And again, as Mark said, it doesn't necessarily, because of the way Prop 2.5 works, it doesn't necessarily result in a change in the overall taxes for the community, but it can be eye-popping. And yet, there's some objective evidence that those house valuations, those home valuations have really gone up across town. So, you know, I hear it. Are there other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Could I just ask one comment on Scott's, and then we'll go to Chris' question just about the efficiencies at the school department. I do think one of the things I know the structural change impact group is going to look at is more of the opportunities for collaborative like opportunities, whether that's consolidating school and town departments. So for example, like the IT departments, could we consolidate those to get efficiencies? As Mark mentioned, there's this lab collaborative. Is there more that we could do where we're partnering with other school districts to save costs? But I do really think, like, and again, I'm speaking as my former education administrator hat on, you know, the state for a long time, their formula for special education funding assumed that districts had about 3.5% of students requiring services. Almost no district now has only 3.5%. I think ours is up to 10%. And they have just fallen so short in providing funding for districts on that. So that's one thing I just wanted to make sure just to mention. All right, let's go to Chris, who has her hand raised.
So I'm not sure, can you hear me?
Yep, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So my question is, on Nextdoor, some people had posted that that there have been 14 overrides and debt exclusions in the last 20 years. And, you know, I think that I don't believe it, but I don't have the data of how many we've had in the last 20 years. Do you folks have that data, or can you get it and start to try to nip that rumor? Because a good friend who typically would vote wrote and said to me, is this really true? If we had 14 overrides and debt exclusions in the last 20 years? And I thought, gosh, I don't think so.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, it isn't true. I mean, I think one of the things that is happening is there is a confusion between the tax increases, for example, that might be due to things like assessments and what's an override or debt exclusion. But we do have that data, and you know, it's definitely not that. I was actually I'm distracted because I'm trying to pull it up for you because I have it right here on my computer and I could potentially like share.
13 proffered, so 13 put forward, and only 10 of those have passed in 20 years. And of course, as we know, only most of those were debt exclusions for the town hall, fire station, senior center, Wellington, Underwood pool, and for the 7 through 12.
Okay,
So,
and one of the things that people don't, sometimes it helps when you talk to someone about,
in the chat too. Go ahead.
sometimes it helps when a person, when you explain that a debt exclusion is like a mortgage, it goes away. a lot of times you end up with a different debt exclusion item, but it's not permanent, whereas an override is permanent. So is there an FAQ page? I'm sorry that I haven't on the website, the Yes for Belmont website.
There is, yeah, we have an FAQ page on our website, and you know, you can certainly look there. And yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to keep in mind, what I would also say to people that are concerned about the number of overrides and debt exclusions is that when you look at Belmont compared to other towns, we're really we really have a lot less in terms of the amount of overrides. Sorry, my hockey player just got home, so I'm gonna go move to a quieter room. This is the page that Paul was referring to in terms of the debt exclusions that I think he just shared a link to. And then just one other thing I did want to make sure to share with folks is that you can see here, you know, since Prop 2.5 was passed in 1980, we've only passed $12 million worth of overrides, and only one, and this should actually say the last 18 years, of 4.5 million. Whereas Winchester, they just passed a 10 million override last year, total of 16 million. Lexington, close to 19 million, and Arlington, 20.5 million and 18 million in the past 15 years. So it really, we really are significantly lower than comparable towns in terms of both the total amount of funding provided to the town and schools from overrides, and just in the last 18 years, 20 years, only 4.5 million compared to, you know, 18 million in Arlington.
And again, I mean, I think, you know, there's objective measures of the fact that we run a very lean town, and I think certainly if you've got kids in the school, one of the most significant is the per pupil spending, particularly in district in Belmont, compared to other Bay State communities, and we are near the bottom. And you know, you can say like, well, per pupil spending isn't everything. I agree, and yet, you know. Money is staff, money is resources, money is supplies. I'm on the board of the Foundation for Belmont Education, and I can tell you that the grant applications that come in are, and Chris will speak to this as well, are not just for you know, enrichment, that they're really often for, you know, really staples of education, providing lessons and education. So FBE is amazing, but it's a small piece of what the schools need to run. So, you know, we run lean, and I wish we didn't run as lean, but you know, we've got a choice in front of us, I think, on April 6th.
So I just, you know, I spent so much time on Zoom and Teams, you'd think I could find the stupid hand raising button, but I can't.
Okay.
Go ahead and talk.
So getting back to Chris's comment on that next door thing, there's a whole group, Citizens for Responsible Belmont, or Financial Responsible Belmont. I saw that post. I didn't have time to actually look up the data and respond, but they claimed there was something like 130. She said the average annual increase was 138%, which she didn't really mean. But yeah, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and somebody who has more time to sit there and do the math than I do and look up all these things really needs to counteract some of that.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Well, and the other thing that it said in that article, it talked about, I believe it was a $2 million increase in health costs. And I'm wondering if they're mistaking actually health costs for current employees versus the OPEB and the health and the pension obligations, so that they don't the people that see these numbers in the budget, is it possible that they either don't or don't care to understand that these are obligations that are from them kicking the can down the road for decades? But that information should get out there, that it's not just, oh, they raised the health costs by, you know, $2 million over the last 2 years or whatever, because it's just, it's misinformation that gets other people riled up and perhaps incorrectly.
Yeah,
So,
and I think, you know, Paul's about to say the same thing. I mean, we have like a team that is trying our best to like go out there on social media and counteract. And Amy Kirsch, who's on the line, has also been helping with that, counteract a lot of the misinformation out there. But if you certainly, you know, there's next door is particularly hard because we don't have as many folks on there. But if you see something, you know, definitely feel free to shoot, even just hit a screenshot or send me a quick email, Nicole@yesforbelmont.org, and just say, hey, I saw this on Nextdoor. Is this true? Or you might want to counteract that, and we can go in and do that.
Okay.
Yeah. Erica, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, hi. I don't really have particularly a question to pose, but I just wanted to kind of throw out why I came on tonight and why, just to like help your cause, and like as a not being involved in the town meeting, not being like just as a resident in the district and whatnot. First of all, I thought the art video that the former high school students put together about how much they benefited from the programs was wonderful. I'm sure it's like this much of what people are looking at, but I was an AP art student as well. I did environmental science with my career, but it was cool to see them speak. And so nice work on that. I was also really drawn to Charlie Conroy. I think I'm saying his name right. I remember him when I met him when I started coaching for the Belmont Soccer Association, and he was running it at the time. I felt like his write-up on your website was really important. I feel like there's a lot of people who have been totally drinking the Kool-Aid, and I've been gung-ho about Belmont since I moved here in 2008. And this year I have been so massively disappointed in the schools. I mean, crushingly, we're out of here, we're leaving, like I'm just like, I loved the administration and I've been just so disappointed. And I'm like, we wear our masks, we don't have anyone in the backyard. Amy will let you know, I can wave to her. She's like, no one's here. But it kind of, I know his write-up spoke to, we're not throwing this money at, like, don't think of what's been happening just this year in the town if you've been really disappointed, because I'm feeling that. I'm feeling pissed about stuff, and I don't want to just give people money that aren't budgeting well or making good decisions. So I felt like that was I'm glad you included not just 100% positive stuff, but some of the frustrations, because I can get on board with all the good stuff. That's easy.
Yeah.
But that helped. I needed to hear tonight, and I was going to ask about it, but I feel like you guys have all spoken about it, was what you've done in the past years with them, with the overrides and reform, because every household, every community, we all have to budget. We all have to make cuts. You can't just throw more money at things. You do need to make choices some months, and you do have to make choices some years. So you can't just keep giving money, even if it's an awesome reason. You do need to look in-house. And I've heard you speak about structural reform and looking interiorly and looking for additional revenue enough that I feel really comfortable that it's not just, we'll fix it with more money.
Yeah.
So you're doing the other work too. So for me, that's what I needed to hear, that it wasn't just, because I know where I'm voting, but I need to hear, I'll talk to my husband, and just, I wanted to give you the feedback on what I was seeing, because it's not even the money this year. God, we saved enough money not vacationing and eating out. This year, the money isn't the problem. It was more the like, I'm not feeling great about the town right now. I'm really sad, and I'm trying, and it's really hard to cheerlead anything right now. Maybe after April 5th, when the kids are back in school, guys, I'll be much more elementary school, I'll be more positive. But thank you for the time tonight. And I really do appreciate everyone's input and being really candid about it.
Yeah, no, thank you for that comment and feedback. I mean, I told this story to other people. Is the reason I was involved in 2015 and 2018, but the reason I actually reached out to get involved in this one was because I was originally so frustrated at this in terms of the schools. And not to say, I know there's people have all different stripes in here, so I don't want to paint this all in a broad brush. But for me personally, I was like, but I was like basically kind of pushing on the school department to do better. But I also did recognize that part of the problem was funding. And so I think that it's important to just separate the two, that people can have their own opinions about what they feel about in terms of leadership and decision making. And that's what I think our school committee elections are for, is for people to express those opinions. But there really is also part of the problem is tied to funding. It's and it's certainly not going to make the problems better, I think, by taking some of the funding away. A good example for me was, I know I was a parent of a fifth grader, really frustrated just with their schedule in the beginning of when they went to hybrid, having, an hour and a half of instruction on Mondays and Tuesdays, and that's it, nothing else. But then learning that when the override failed, and part of the reason why it was less for fifth graders was because sixth graders had a world language elective on Monday and Tuesdays. My daughter's in cohort B, so she was Monday and Tuesday, she was at home. But on the remote days, sixth graders had world languages and fifth graders didn't. And then coming to learn that we used to have world languages in fifth grade, but when the override failed in 2010, they had to cut the teachers for that. And they never had the money to add it back. And so it kind of helped me like see the through line between how some of the lack of funding did like lead to some of the results from this year. Again, everybody should make their own decisions about how they feel how this year's gone, but I don't think it all ties back to funding, but I think certainly it was like part of the problem. It's just not having the teachers to add classes for some of the kids, especially at the middle school level. So anyways, thank you for your comments. I think that just really resonated with me. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the most pernicious ideas is that this is a freebie, that you can vote no and nothing bad will happen. There won't be cuts. Everything will be the same. And that, I think Mark would tell you this as well. That is absolutely not the case. When overrides fail, cuts get made, and substantial cuts. And unfortunately, that then becomes the new baseline on which level service and level funding is that degraded baseline becomes the new normal on which you're budgeting going forward. So we know back in 2010 that there were staff reductions at the high school and throughout the public schools that led to reductions in course offerings and larger classes and the whole bit. We saw it happen. I blogged about it. The Citizen Patch wrote about it. Citizen Herald wrote about it. It's there. But it's easy to forget with the passage of time. But the town is going to be forced to do what it needs to do if this doesn't pass. So we really need to step up now, I think.
I think we have Dan has his hand raised.
Yep.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for putting this together. Very, very informative. And for the record, I already voted yes, sent it in already. But a couple of things that I wanted to bring up. One, I think it would be really helpful to put together essentially like a roadmap for when we do want to expect new overrides, because I think the reality is obviously that the expenses are going to continue outstripping the revenue. So I think for a lot of folks, they think it's one and done, and not realizing that no, we really need to to keep up with this, and every 3, 4, maybe 5 years we expect to have to put an override together. And I think for some people who have fixed incomes or some other constraints, if they're doing their long-term planning and they can see that, if you want to live in Belmont and have, the services that we currently have, and maybe even more, you really need to plan for that sort of increase every few years. And if it's not going to work for you, you just need to, make other plans at some point, right? And you have to basically be able to see that in not just in a, hey, we won, we're done, we did the override. It's like, no, every 3, 4 years we should plan to have one, right? So I think that's one thing. I think that would be really helpful to communicate that out. And then in terms of looking for additional revenue, one thing that's come up in the past, and I've never seen really good resolution on it, is Belmont doesn't have a big commercial base, but it does have some pretty well-run and funded private schools. And they really get a free ride because they take advantage of all the town services, the police, fire department, the roads. I think for a town like Belmont that has really a shoestring budget for the schools, to have Belmont Hill and Belmont Day, whose endowment is huge, and they don't contribute a penny to the town's operating budget, I think that's something that should be looked at. And there's precedents, maybe not at the private school level, but definitely at the university level, where the universities pitch in to help the towns that they reside in. And I strongly encourage, our leaders in Belmont to look for opportunities, obviously cordially at first, to see if we can get an agreement in terms of cost sharing with them.
I'd like to intervene for a second and just thank you for that, Dan. And just to ask Mark, I'm not sure that Belmont Hill and Belmont they pay absolutely nothing. I know payments in lieu of taxes pilots have been, on the board for a long time, but is it really the case that
No, they
they're
don't
getting
pay.
squat?
They don't pay
no,
anything.
nothing. Zero.
Yeah, zero.
We had an initiative. So Dan, that's a great point. And good question. I mean, you're right. Like Watertown, my brother's a member that was a member of the school committee for years, but they're flush with cash anyway, right? They have such a huge commercial base. And I think when Harvard was there, they were getting $1 million a year out of Harvard, in the Arsenal Mall. Is that right, Paul? And so, I think the challenge here is we can ask, and we have asked, absolutely. Do we have to go back and do it again? Without question. We also sent out letters to all of the religious establishments in town, and my church too, Scott, right? And you get questions about, well, geez, we're kind of on a shoestring budget, if you're not the Catholic Church, perhaps you're just, like I belong to the Plymouth Congregational Church. We really don't have a lot of money to give, but we're willing to do more. So we have to revisit that, but you can't force it, Dan. So you can't say,
Right.
The last thing that I would ever agree to is that we're not going to provide services to you. I mean, we can't do that, right? God forbid if a kid gets hurt on Belmont Hill School during one of the games, and we have to send an ambulance up there, right? I mean, we're not going to not do that, correct? And so, or police if needed, or whatever the need might be. But that being said, we're in such tough shape right now that I think revisiting that, at least with some of those institutions, makes abundant sense. And I think it really needs to be, we've had the assessors do it. I think it needs to come from the select board. I mean, we're the executive branch of government in town. Not that we're so powerful. I mean, be a big deal, right? But the fact of the matter is, it really needs to come from the select board, and we need to negotiate some kind of an arrangement where they pitch in based on the services that they receive. And if you follow pilot payments, and I do, most institutions pay much less than the services they receive. If you were to market, if you were to cost out the services they get, Dan, like even in Boston, it's much less than what they give. That, right? So. Yeah. We're not asking them to pay dollar for dollar for what the services that we render, but at least contribute in some way.
Right. And my thinking is, as part of the overall long-term planning, right, to have an override every few years, we can at least tell people that, hey, we are going to try to get some, additional revenue from somewhere else. It's not going to offset it, but it's a way of making sure that everyone's pitching in. Right,
yeah, absolutely, Dan. And I agree with you. I think reflection. I mean, I heard you. I think we breathed a sigh of relief in 2015. We needed the money. We were bankrupt. Like David Keel would say, we were tapped out. We were, and John Fanley would say we had no money. We couldn't pay our sped bills, and so we absolutely needed it. And thankfully, the community supported it. And I get it. Raises some taxes here. And we sort of breathed a sigh of relief. And I was on the board. So this is self-reflection for me. We just said, okay, we're all set. Let's just sort of tool along here. And we really need to establish a plan. And that's exactly what we need to do. And we need to tell all of you what the plan is. We need to say, here's the plan going forward, and have the political will, if you will, because politics sometimes comes into play. From my point of view, whatever, going on for my final term here, I think we need to schedule out for the next 10 years, if we can, what the plan is and where overrides will fall in. And frankly, we do need to do something about our skating rink. It's an embarrassment. And we do need to do something about our library that was built in '65. And I was on the library fundraising committee, and I'm going to I can't really continue that as a member of the select board. I'm a strong supporter of the library and the services it provides. It's sort of a cultural center in town. We need to figure out a way to raise more private funds there. But at some point, we do need to do a debt exclusion. So I think we need to lay that out. I'm going to ask my colleagues to support my efforts. I know that hopefully they'll commit to that and say, lay it out and have the political will to communicate to our residents in town what the plan is.
I think the political instinct is to say, well, if we wait until our backs are against the wall, then the voters will understand that we've done everything we can, our backs are against the wall, and so they need to vote yes. But I actually think practically the way it works is voters are like, why are you always coming to me in a crisis, right? Like, it would be like if somebody kept coming to you, like, I've got an emergency, you really got to lend me $50. And you'd be like, why are you always in these crises? Instead of sort of saying, listen, here's our long-term vision plan. We were foreseeing this, and now we're coming to you because we planned for it.
Absolutely, Paul.
Yeah.
You know what? And look, I think that if I could go on for just a moment here, because I have talked to the Citizens for Responsible Belmont and others, because I will represent all citizens. I think if they're listened to and respected, we're not always going to agree. And look, I ran the 2015 campaign and 2016, we had the successful override, and there were a number of folks who were historically my supporters that ran the no campaign. But, when I ran again, they supported me. I think as long as folks are being listened to, because we have to say that we're kind of in this together. We can disagree, and we're going to disagree, and that's okay. But if they're listened to and they feel as though we've been transparent and they're respected, they can vote no. I disagree with them completely. I'm voting yes. But, as we move forward and we communicate to them the needs in a more transparent way, hopefully we can get some of those no's over to yes. That's my
Yeah.
thoughts, at least.
What I like to say is that we all love our children and we all love Belmont. We may have different opinions on what's best for the town, but everybody has the best interest of the town.
I love Joe Biden's line. He said, they're not our enemies. They were just
Yeah.
our adversaries. And so that's the way.
Yeah.
We haven't
absolutely.
always served and governed that way, Nicole. Looking back on my short tenure, now that perhaps I'm older, I think differently. And this is not campaign speech, but I think we have to look at folks and say, they all love Belmont. We just have different points of view about what to do.
Yeah.
And as long as we respect them and listen to them, we can move forward together. And that's exactly what we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Amy, you had your hand raised.
I do. Erica, you resonated with me. And I have to say, if you're not upset as a parent this year, and I have a 4th grader and a 9th grader, then you're not paying attention. Our kids do need a lot of attention this year, way more than they've ever needed in any year. And it's really frustrating. And there's a lot of reasons for that, including COVID and management and whatever the reasons are. And it is hard to pass an override when people are upset at their school experience, because that's what we're paying for in Belmont, and why a lot of us moved here that have kids in the school system. So I feel you, and I didn't want you to think that you're alone there, because you're not. I am so upset too. And I think it's something that, we are getting to the end of the tunnel. There's a light coming up, and it's still not going to be easy. We're still going to be wearing masks, and there's still going to be protocols that we don't agree with. And I'm going to take my vote, and I'm going to vote for the override, and I'm still going to be upset, and it's not going to change much. But I do firmly believe that by taking away that vote, I'm not going to fix the problem. Classroom sizes and everything else, there's so much that impacts the other, with funding. So I'm holding my nose. I'm going to do it. And, I do hope for a lot of focus on getting this to be a better place for our kids, for our community, and for our parents and experience.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, definitely second that. It's been a really hard year. So,
it's been a hard year.
Yeah.
And I don't know any parent that has gotten their way. There's no winner this year at all. The kids haven't won, the parents haven't won, the administrators haven't won. This is not the year for winners, and it really does bite. It hurts all around. So we'll get through, and I do think that this will improve, and this time next year we're not going to be in the same place, ideally.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're on the cusp of change, and both with the pandemic and with other things, and with the 7 through 12 school getting ready to open. We've come through a really dark year, and I think a lot of institutions that we all really looked to and relied on and admired, some of them let us down this year. I guess I would just say, don't make a no vote kind of a monument to your anger, because I think in the months ahead, things are going to be changing. And the town and the schools are going to need money to affect change. And, Mark's got great ideas going into office. Some of our school committee candidates have great ideas coming into office. They need the resources to realize those visions, and so that you gotta kind of, as President Biden would say, you got to look ahead and look to the future and the good stuff that's coming down the road, rather than what's happened in the last year. Yeah, thumbs up. Thanks, Mark. Any other questions? We've been here for an hour, so I don't want to keep people too long. No? Well, let me start, and Nicole as well. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. Great questions, and I really appreciate you taking time out of your evening to join us and give us your thoughts.
Hey, Paul, can I just offer that, I've been doing like sort of listening tour. If anyone wants to talk with me, perhaps you hear that folks are questioning whether there should be an override. I'm happy to do one-on-ones. I'm happy to do group chats. I've been trying to talk to folks that know and convincing them otherwise. I'm not certain it's working, but at least we're listening to one another, right? And so I offer that up here if you want to spread the word a bit in terms of as we get closer. I strongly support it. I think we need it, but we also need to focus more collaboratively on structural reform. And I'm committed to do that with both the schools and the town. And hopefully we can get there.
You want to drop your email, Mark?
Yeah. In the chat room?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
If you know of folks, so we are, thank you everyone for attending. I know we're all very busy and many of us spend our days on Zoom looking at screens. So it's hard to ask folks to look at screens again at night. We are doing, if you know of any folks that have questions and have concerns or want to learn more, Paul and I are doing this again tomorrow night, I think at 8, and then again we have an option. I don't know if anyone's signed up yet, and then next Wednesday at 8, we have 2 more info sessions. You can sign up on our website. And then, my email, I'll put it in the chat too. If anybody just wants to reach out to me, I'd be happy to talk to anybody about the override and about the
Those
the
precinct,
campaign.
those
It's been
precinct
really,
events next week, Nicole, maybe you can send me.
yeah, they're anybody. So
Okay,
they're
maybe
open
I'll
to
join one of
anybody.
them. I don't know what I got going on, but maybe I'll help
yeah.
you. If you want,
see
I
if,
can join again. Yeah.
And so, we're happy to talk to anybody too about the campaign. It's been really inspiring to see so many people come out and support and just, and no matter what side you're on, it's always great to hear from people and get to know more of our friends and neighbors in Belmont. So thank you everybody for your time. And don't forget, regardless of how you're voting, there is no early voting. If you want to vote, if you don't want to vote in person on April 6th, you need to request your absentee ballot by March 31st, and then just return it to town hall by the 6th. So, but it's not like the November election. There isn't sort of an option to go to town hall and vote early in person. It's either absentee ballot, you request it by March 31st, or vote in person on April 6th.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Enjoy your evening. Bye.